Now we want to make it so that something happens when we submit the form, right? But let's think a little bit about how we're going to structure our JavaScript in this project. Let's put a little more thought behind that. So we talked about objects a bit earlier, right? And not this one. This one. So could you have an object? All our properties so far have been strings, it just so happens. But I suppose you could have other kinds of values there, right? Stuff, some array, other objects. What about functions? We can assign functions to variables. Could we assign a function as a property of an object? So that's the key do things. What if on the right side, I just put a function? Comma, even more properties. Is that legal? Well, let's see. So if we can get to count by saying app.count get 4, could we say app.doThings, get the function, call it? That seem like a thing we could do? Doing the things. Yeah, we can. Why not? So this time around, let's put all our JavaScript in a single object. Can avoid creating more than one global variable here. So in app.js, let's create a variable called app. Seems pretty good. And that's going to be an object. Now we want some stuff to happen right off the bat, right? So I'm going to create a function inside this object that I'm going to call as soon as the page loads. So I'm going to call it init, for lack of a better word. And it's going to be a function. Remember, this is just an object property, so I can put my trailing comma on there so I don't forget it. Because it's especially easy to forget when we're dealing with functions like this. Because curly brace comma is kind of a funny thing. So functions that happen to be properties of objects are called methods. So I'll use the word method a lot. That just means a function that happens to live on an object. So I want to make sure I call this stuff. It's a lovely function, but it's never going to get called if I don't call it. So at the bottom here, I'm just going to say app init. Run that as soon as the page loads. Totally works. So what do we want to do when the page first loads? We just want to start listening for other stuff to happen, right? We want to tell the page when something happens, the form is submitted, we're going to do something else. So we need to tell it to start listening, and that's all we really need to do. So we should probably grab the form so we can tell it to start listening for the submission. We gave the form an ID of flick form like this, so we could use query selector to grab that. Document dot query selector. Pass in hash flick form. Maybe I want to be real specific, make sure it's really a form element. I don't want it to find it unless it's a form. Form hash flick form, why not? Now I could save that to a variable and then call add event listener, but I'm not going to do anything else with the form, so I could also just chain it on the end. Now that ends up being a pretty darn long line, and it's not super easy at a glance to tell that I'm even doing something after this. So I'm going to do this. Just indent these under here. What? Yep, totally legal. If JavaScript sees that a line begins with a dot, it thinks, oh, okay, this is supposed to go with what's on the line above. It figures it out. So we can do this, and that's a little easier to read. So when you're chaining things on the end, it's nice to indent them underneath. Keep them lined up. So we're telling it, when something happens, do something else, right? When what happens? What kind of event? A click? A submit. Yes, indeed. So submit. And what are we going to do? We're going to call some function. We haven't written it yet, right? So let's write the function. Let's not worry about exactly what this thing's really going to do. Let's just make sure we can even add an event listener and handle an event. So we want our object to have another method, another function property. Let's call it handle submit. So handle submit, colon, just like any other property, except instead of a string or something, it happens to be a function. Once again, I will make sure that I put my comma in here because I will totally forget it otherwise. And we know that if this thing handles an event, it's going to be passed an event object, right? So I'll go ahead and put that in my argument list. And since it is a form submission, I know I need to stop the submission from happening, right? I need to prevent the default behavior for that event. So ev.prevent default. Then let's just get the flick name out of the form and console log it, just to show that we have this hooked up right. So how can I get the form without using query selector? Yeah. It's the target of the event, right? The thing that the event happened to. The event was submit, and what got submitted? The form. So ev.target will be the form. So again, I can save that to a variable if I want. And then I could have a variable for the flick name if I wanted. Or I could just console log f dot what? The name that we gave it, right? So that will automatically, a form will automatically have a property with the name of each of its elements. f.flickName. Now we know this is an object property. f.flickName. Now that's the actual input. We want what's typed in it. So dot value, right? That's neat and all. But how do we refer to this from here? We have our method. I could totally call app.handleSubmit, but fat lot of good that's going to do me. I want to make this the what happens, or what we do after that happens. How do I refer to it from here? Keith? So now if we did open close parentheses, well, it would actually execute it, right? And the result would be what gets set up as an event handler. But that needs to be a function. We're not running it. JavaScript's running it for us. But it's no longer just handle submit. It's not just a function living somewhere. That would be like That'd be like, okay, so I have meals.breakfast, so let's just write breakfast. Right? Can't do that, right? Now that's a method. Ooh, getting fancy. What were you going to say, Alex? So it's now a method on an object. We know out here we could refer to as app.handleSubmit. So we can say app.handleSubmit, but it just happens that we call this variable app. That's kind of arbitrary. Inside the actual object, surely there's a way to refer to the object itself. Most of the time there is. We call it this, which you will learn to despise. So for now, let's just say inside an object, you can refer to that object as this. So this dot handle submit is how we'll refer to handle submit. That kind of makes sense. So this is a reference to the current object. Does it work? I've got my console open. Name a flick. The Rock. Hooray, we did it. Go us. We can make this thing just a tad more flexible. If we didn't hardcode form hash flick form in here, I think it'd be cool to pass that in as an argument to a init. Like this. So init can just take a form selector as an argument and just pass that on to query selector. So out here where we call init, we'll pass in what we want form selector to be. Just kind of keeps this object sort of independent so it could be used somewhere else. Or we could change our HTML. We'd only have to change it down here. We don't have to change anything inside app. You dig? Now, did I break it when I did that? Always test again if you make more changes. Refresh. The island, the one nobody saw with Ewan McGregor. Yay, it still works. Good enough for a commit. Set up submit handler for flick form.